I had been counting the days for our 32nd wedding anniversary, not because I was excited, but because I had a plan of my own. My husband, Greg, had always thought he controlled everything in our life, the house, the finances, even the image we projected to friends. But what he didn't know was that I had been silently preparing for this moment for months. And tonight, with 80 guests gathered in our grand dining room, his plan to humiliate me would backfire in a way he could never imagine. The house looked perfect. Crystal chandeliers reflected soft golden light across the polished floors, and the dining table stretched like a palace banquet hall, adorned with flowers I had personally chosen. Every detail mattered tonight, not for him, but for me. I had invited a few close allies discreetly, a lawyer who would be my backup, an accountant who would quietly help me protect my assets, and a few friends who could witness what would unfold. Greg, of course, had no idea. He strutted around, mingling, laughing too loudly, and occasionally whispering to Denise with that smug, self-satisfied grin. He clearly thought this party was all about him, his declaration of dominance. Little did he know everything was about me. Halfway through the evening, I noticed him nervously checking his watch. He always wanted to control the timing, the moment he would make his move. I let him stew in that little bit of impatience, because a little tension is always delicious when you're the one in control. The guests were laughing at a story someone told, a minor embarrassment from Greg's past, which he waved off awkwardly, but suddenly, everything went quiet. Greg stood up, clearing his throat. All eyes turned to him. He glanced at me, his smirk almost daring me to interfere. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice rich with arrogance, "I have an announcement to make." I felt the room tilt slightly in my favor as my heart remained calm. I knew exactly what was coming. His eyes flicked to Denise, who was sitting in the front row looking far too excited for my liking. I could see the rehearsed gasp ready on her lips. I also saw several guests leaning forward in curiosity, unaware that a storm was about to hit. I want a divorce," Greg said, voice rising. "And you, my dear wife, need to move out immediately. Denise and I are together now." A hush fell over the room. Forks hovered in midair. Glasses rattled slightly on the table. My husband, my partner of 32 years, had thought he could humiliate me in front of everyone, and he had chosen the perfect moment to do it. Or so he thought. I remained seated for a heartbeat, letting the silence do the work for me. Let them all feel the sting of betrayal first. Then I rose slowly, deliberately, letting my presence dominate the room. "Actually, Greg," I said, calm and composed, "there's something you've forgotten." His smirk faltered. A flicker of panic crossed his face. "What are you talking about?" he asked, voice tightening. I motioned to the lawyer I had strategically positioned near the entrance. The man nodded and handed me a set of documents. "These," I said, holding them high, "are the documents proving that this house has been solely in my name for the past 15 years. Everything you think you can take tonight is legally mine." Murmurs spread across the room. Denise's face went pale. Her eyes darted around, realizing the story she had rehearsed with Greg was about to collapse. Guests looked from me to him, whispering, shocked. "And," I continued, letting the words hang in the air, "since I anticipated this little drama, I've also arranged something for all of you to witness." Greg opened his mouth, then closed it. He sputtered, but no words came. The bravado he had carefully cultivated over decades was crumbling under the weight of my preparation. I took a deep breath, my calmness in stark contrast to the chaos brewing around me. "You see, Greg, while you were planning your grand announcement, I was quietly securing my assets, protecting my home, and making sure tonight no one, including you, gets to humiliate me." Several guests began whispering, clearly impressed. Some nodded subtly, others looked on in awe. I could see the realization dawning on those who had long suspected his arrogance but never had proof. Greg's face turned ashen. Denise covered her mouth in horror, while a few of our older friends who had watched our marriage evolve over decades gave me approving glances. The power shift in that room was palpable. "I want everyone here to understand something," I said, voice firm now, commanding attention. "This house, this life, has been mine as much as his, and tonight you see the truth. Betrayal has consequences." I paused, letting my words sink in. Greg opened his mouth again, as if to argue, but the look on his face said it all. He was defeated, humiliated in front of 80 witnesses, powerless to reverse the tide. I smiled faintly, letting the victory settle in. "Feel free to enjoy the rest of the evening," I said softly, almost sweetly. And as for Greg and Denise, I let the sentence linger, letting the silent humiliation do the work for me. I returned to my seat, calm, collected, victorious, while the guests erupted into a mixture of whispers, soft applause, and stunned murmurs. Tonight, the lesson was clear. No one walks over me, and betrayal always comes at a cost. The moment I sat back down, I felt the weight of 100 eyes on me. Greg slumped into his chair like a man who had just realized the world was collapsing around him. Denise sat frozen, her fake composure crumbling by the second. I could see it, the shock, the humiliation, the disbelief painted on their faces. But I wasn't done yet, not even close. Guests murmured among themselves, exchanging glances and whispers. Some were clearly trying to stifle their laughter at Greg's predicament. Others were shocked by the audacity of the moment. I could see Aunt Margaret shaking her head in disbelief, while a few of my closest friends exchanged triumphant smiles. They had always known I was stronger than Greg gave me credit for, and now everyone else was seeing it too. Greg cleared his throat, trying to salvage what little dignity he had left. I don't know what you think you're doing," he stammered, his voice trembling. "This house, the money, we built this life together." I cut him off with a slow, deliberate shake of my head. "We've built a life together? Greg, you clearly forgot who's been keeping everything afloat, who's been quietly making sure our home and our finances were secure while you played the hero in everyone's eyes." A few guests leaned forward, intrigued. Greg's attempts to regain control were failing spectacularly. He looked around, searching for some ally in the room, some witness who would back him up. But all he saw were faces of shock, judgment, and silent amusement. Denise finally spoke, her voice small and shaky. I didn't know." "You didn't know?" I echoed, my voice rising with controlled fury. "Denise, you didn't know that I had anticipated this? That I had already legally protected my home and all my assets months ago? That I've been planning every step so that no one could ever take me by surprise?" She shrank back, and I could see Greg's jaw tighten. His arrogance had always been his shield, and now that shield was shattered. The guests watched, riveted, as the drama unfolded like a play they hadn't expected to see. I stood up again, walking slowly around the table, letting the papers in my hand glint under the chandelier's light. "Let me be clear," I said, my voice calm but cutting through the room like steel. "Every document here proves that this house, this life, is legally mine. Every asset you thought you could claim is untouchable, and tonight, everyone here is a witness to your failure." A few whispers of approval rippled through the guests. I could hear some people quietly saying, "She's right," or "I knew she was smart." That fueled me even more. I wanted Greg and Denise to feel every ounce of humiliation, to understand that betrayal has consequences that can't be erased. Greg tried to interrupt again, but I raised a hand, silencing him without raising my voice. "Not a word, Greg. Tonight isn't about what you think is yours. It's about the truth. And the truth is, you underestimated me again." I could see him swallow hard. His pride, his ego, his carefully crafted public image, it was all crumbling before 80 witnesses. The room was thick with tension, and I let it sit there, savoring every second. Then I added the final twist, the part that would leave everyone, especially Greg and Denise, completely speechless. And just so everyone here knows, I said, my voice low but clear, I've also prepared something special for tonight. Something that will ensure that not just Greg, but anyone who ever doubts me, remembers that underestimating me comes at a cost. I didn't reveal what it was yet. I let the suspense hang in the air. Greg's face turned an unsteady shade of red, and Denise looked like she might faint. Guests leaned in, some shifting in their seats, some barely breathing, all waiting. At that moment, my lawyer stepped forward. He handed me another set of documents. I held them up for everyone to see. These, I said, are the finalized agreements transferring all shared investments, the business accounts, and any liquid assets solely into my name, Greg. Everything you thought you could control is now firmly in my possession. And yes, that includes the company you've been bragging about for years. The room went silent. Whispers of shock and awe spread like wildfire. Greg's hand shook, and I could see Denise glancing around, desperate for a way out. But there was no escape. Tonight, their plan to humiliate me had spectacularly backfired. I took a deep breath, letting the intensity settle in. I knew that this was just the beginning. The real satisfaction wouldn't come from just revealing ownership or legal rights. It would come from watching Greg and Denise squirm as they realized how completely I had outsmarted them. I smiled faintly, scanning the faces of our guests. Some were clearly impressed, others whispered about the boldness of my move, and a few exchanged glances that said plainly, "She's stronger than anyone thought." And in that moment, I felt a surge of triumph. Tonight, the anniversary that Greg had planned as a stage for public humiliation had turned into a showcase of my resilience, intelligence, and carefully hidden power. And the best part, there was still so much more to come. The room was thick with tension. Even after my dramatic reveal, the air felt electric, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. Greg had slumped into his chair again, but this time, he wasn't just defeated, he was furious. His hands trembled slightly, and I could see the muscle in his jaw tightening. Denise, who had been attempting to maintain a calm composure, was now pale as a ghost, her fake smile gone. She kept glancing at me, like maybe she could somehow rewind the night, undo my careful preparation. But I wasn't done. Not even close. I stood up, letting the attention shift entirely back to me. My heels clicked softly on the polished floor, a subtle but deliberate sound that drew everyone's gaze. I wanted them all to see me, not as a victim, not as the wife being humiliated, but as the orchestrator of the evening, in full control. "I can see some of you are still wondering if all this is real," I said, my voice calm even, but with an edge that made people lean in. "Perhaps you think Greg just made a mistake. Perhaps you think Denise somehow didn't know. But the truth is far more interesting." I paused, letting the suspense settle like a blanket over the guests. A few whispered to each other, and I caught a glimpse of my oldest friend Maria nodding subtly. She understood. She had always understood that I was capable of more than anyone gave me credit for. I walked closer to the table where Greg and Denise sat, papers in hand, and let my gaze linger on him. "Greg, you spent decades building an image, convincing everyone that you were the provider, the protector, the man who could run this household and control this life. And yet here you are exposed, humbled, and powerless because you underestimated me. Again." He opened his mouth to argue, but I raised a hand, not a word. The guests leaned forward, captivated. Some shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, unsure whether to intervene. Others were quietly thrilled. There's nothing more compelling than watching arrogance collapse. "And Denise," I said, turning to her slowly, letting the words sink in, "you thought you were stepping into a life already built for you, a life I had created, maintained, and protected. But you didn't see the walls around it, the measures I had taken to ensure no one could just waltz in and take what wasn't theirs. You didn't see me." Her eyes widened, and I could see the realization hit her. She had believed this was going to be her moment too, a triumphant celebration of stolen love. Instead, she was trapped in the spotlight, exposed alongside him. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. There was satisfaction in seeing the shock, the humiliation, the disbelief, and I wasn't done far from it. "I have something else prepared," I continued, letting my voice carry across the room. "Some of you may be wondering what comes next. Well, you're about to find out." At that moment, I motioned to the side, where my lawyer discreetly brought over a folder. I opened it slowly, letting the glossy envelopes catch the light, and held them up. "These," I said, addressing everyone, "contain details of all the financial arrangements I've secured, the accounts, the investments, the properties. You will all see that what Greg thought he could control is now entirely out of his reach. Every step he took to humiliate me, every plan he made, has been anticipated." Gasps swept through the room. Gasps whipped her among themselves, some openly expressing admiration. "I knew she was smart," one woman murmured. "I didn't realize she was this prepared." Greg's face contorted with disbelief and fury. He leaned toward Denise and whispered something, probably an attempt to salvage some shred of pride, but I could see the panic in his eyes. His mind was racing, trying to figure out a way to turn this around, but the game had already shifted. The power was no longer his. I walked past him, making sure to keep the room's attention. "You see, Greg, I have learned over the years that people who betray trust always assume they can act with impunity. They think their deception will remain hidden, their schemes unnoticed. But every action has a consequence. Every lie has a price. And tonight, that price is being paid." A few guests clutched their glasses, unsure whether to sip or simply stare. I could feel the tension in the room like a physical force. And yet, amid all this chaos, I remained calm, steady, controlled, untouchable. Then I dropped the subtle hint that would make the evening unforgettable. "And to ensure everyone here remembers this night," I said, letting my words linger, "I've also arranged for a few surprises. Nothing dangerous, of course, just enough to make sure that Greg and Denise truly understand the consequences of their choices. I didn't reveal the surprises yet. I let their imaginations run wild." Greg swallowed hard, his face now a mixture of anger and fear. Denise's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her clutch bag. The guests murmured, speculating on what could possibly come next. The beauty of it all was that the anticipation alone was punishing. Greg had spent weeks imagining his triumphant declaration of love and freedom in front of 80 people. He had rehearsed the speech, memorized his tone, and carefully staged every moment. And yet here he was utterly powerless, watching the night he planned to dominate slip through his fingers. I walked back to my seat slowly, allowing the room to absorb every detail. "Tonight," I said softly, almost to myself, "is a reminder that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's patience, preparation, and knowing exactly when to reveal the truth." I took my seat, letting the whispers and astonished glances wash over me. Some guests were clearly impressed. Some whispered doubts about Greg's character for the first time, and a few even looked at me with a hint of envy, realizing the power I wielded quietly for decades. Greg sat there, red-faced and trembling, trying to force a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Denise leaned toward him, muttering something inaudible. And I knew deep down that the humiliation had only just begun. The night was far from over, and I had carefully planned every next step, because this wasn't just about the house, the money, or even public humiliation. This was about reclaiming my life, asserting my strength, and making sure that anyone who thought they could betray me would understand exactly what that cost. And as the evening continued, I watched, patient and poised, knowing that the true revenge The kind that leaves a lasting mark, was only just beginning. The evening had reached a point where silence was almost unbearable. Greg was sitting rigidly in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. Denise's eyes were wide, darting from me to the guests and back again, as if hoping anyone would intervene on their behalf. But there was no ally here tonight. Every person in this room had now witnessed the first wave of my carefully orchestrated humiliation, and the look of shock and awe on their faces told me that my plan was working perfectly. I sipped my wine slowly, letting the liquid linger on my tongue. Every detail of this moment mattered: my calmness, my posture, the way I allowed the room to hang on my words without speaking too soon. Greg thought he had prepared me for this moment over the years. He thought he could corner me, embarrass me, and claim the moral high ground. But he had underestimated one thing: patience, preparation, and quiet intelligence. Greg cleared his throat, trying once again to regain control. I think this is all blown out of proportion, he said, his voice shaking. I just wanted to be honest about my feelings. Isn't that what this is about? I looked directly at him, my gaze sharp and unwavering. Honesty, Greg? You call this honesty? I asked, my voice calm but cutting. You planned a spectacle to humiliate me in front of everyone we know, thinking that your charm and arrogance would shield you from consequences. That is not honesty, that is manipulation. The room murmured again. Some guests were openly whispering, some trying to figure out how to react. A few older friends of ours looked as though they were seeing Greg in a completely new light. I could feel the tide of sympathy subtly shifting from him to me, and it was exhilarating. Denise finally spoke, her voice trembling. I just didn't realize. You didn't realize? I echoed softly, tilting my head. Denise, you didn't realize that I have spent years quietly securing my home, my finances, and my reputation? That I've always been the backbone of this life, while Greg pretended to be the hero? Her lips parted slightly and she looked away. I could see the flicker of fear in her eyes. The humiliation was sinking in, and I knew Greg felt it too. The slow, heavy realization that his carefully constructed plan had completely backfired. I stood again, allowing my movement to command attention. You see, I said, letting the words hang in the air, power is not about who speaks loudest or who makes the grandest declaration. It's about foresight, patience, and knowing when to act. Greg, you failed on every count tonight. And Denise? I let the pause stretch, savoring it. You failed by being part of it. I could see him trying to interrupt, but I raised a hand. The room went silent, guests watching intently. Not a word, I said firmly. Tonight isn't about excuses. It's about lessons. Then I pulled out another folder, a smaller one, filled with photos, emails, and messages that Greg had forgotten were saved. And just so everyone understands the extent of what's been happening behind the scenes, I said, letting my voice be calm but menacing, I've documented everything. Greg's face paled. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had forgotten about my meticulous attention to detail, the way I had quietly gathered evidence over the months to protect myself. Denise gasped softly, covering her mouth, as the documents were passed briefly among a few trusted guests. Murmurs spread instantly, the weight of revelation filling the room. I paced slowly, deliberately, letting the suspense build. You see, Greg, honesty is not planning a public humiliation and calling it truth. Honesty is being accountable, and tonight, everyone here can see the truth about you, about your intentions, and about the people you try to manipulate. By now, some guests were openly whispering to each other, nodding in recognition. Others were looking at me with a mix of admiration and surprise, perhaps realizing that all these years I had quietly been the one in control. Greg leaned toward Denise, whispering urgently, but it was useless. Everyone could see the desperation, the fear creeping into his posture. For the first time in decades, he was powerless. I returned to my seat slowly, savoring the tension, the whispers, the realization in every pair of eyes. "Tonight," I said softly, "is about truth, strength, and the consequences of betrayal. And while this may feel like the end for some, for me, it's just the beginning." I smiled faintly, letting the weight of my words settle. Greg was defeated, yes, but the real game was far from over. I had carefully plotted the next moves, knowing exactly how to ensure that the humiliation would continue in subtle, calculated ways, extending far beyond this evening. The guests shifted in their seats, the room buzzing with quiet speculation. Who would have thought that after 32 years, the wife, quiet, composed, underestimated, would be the one commanding attention, controlling the room and orchestrating every moment? And as I sat back, poised and victorious, I knew that what had just begun would unfold in ways Greg and Denise could never anticipate. The revenge was far from complete, but tonight had set the stage perfectly. The next moves would be even more satisfying, and this time, I would ensure there would be no chance for them to recover. The room had shifted into a strange, almost surreal energy. What had begun as a celebration now felt like the stage of a courtroom drama. Every pair of eyes was on us, watching, calculating, judging. Greg sat rigid, his pride crumbling with every passing second. Denise, still pale and trembling, refused to meet anyone's gaze. And I, calm and composed, felt the thrill of control settle deep into my chest. I had already revealed the house, the finances, and even the documents proving my independence. But tonight, I wanted more than that. I wanted Greg and Denise to feel the consequences of their betrayal, to experience the slow burn of humiliation as every person in that room saw them as they truly were. Greg leaned forward, trying to regain composure. This isn't fair." "You can't just—" I held up a hand, cutting him off. "Fair? Fairness is earned, Greg. Honesty is earned. Respect is earned. You've spent decades thinking arrogance and charm could shield you from accountability, but you were wrong, and tonight that truth is visible for everyone here." I paused, letting the silence stretch. The guests leaned in, whispering among themselves. Some nodded subtly, some looked shocked, and a few exchanged glances that said, "I knew she was strong, but this is something else." Then I brought out the next layer of my plan, the guest letters. Over the past few weeks, I had discreetly gathered messages, texts, and confessions from close friends and colleagues who had long suspected Greg's duplicity. I had printed them carefully, and now, one by one, I began reading excerpts aloud. I always admired Denise, but I felt uncomfortable with the way Greg behaved behind closed doors. I read, letting the words echo. A few guests gasped. Greg's face twisted in disbelief, while Denise's hands shook violently. Greg promised one thing, but his actions told a different story. The whispers grew louder. Guests exchanged shocked glances. Some people I barely knew looked at each other incredulously. Greg's smirk had vanished completely, replaced by a mixture of rage and panic. I continued pacing slowly around the room, letting my words and the weight of the evidence sink in. "Do you see, everyone? This isn't just about tonight. This is about years of deception, lies, and betrayal. And now, those lies are on display." Denise covered her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. Greg tried to speak again, but the room had turned against him, not through words, but through truth, exposure, and the careful orchestration of facts that no one could argue with. Then I added the final touch for tonight, the public confrontation challenge. I handed a small envelope to each guest, discreetly prepared ahead of time. Inside were brief statements about Greg's behavior, verified and confirmed. I thought it only fair, I said softly, that everyone here has a clear understanding of the reality. Each envelope contains a piece of the truth, something Greg can't deny. Gasps rippled through the room as people opened them. Some murmured, others nodded. A few openly whispered comments about how clever I had been. And all the while, Greg and Denise were trapped, exposed, unable to salvage even a shred of dignity. I leaned toward Greg, my voice calm but deadly. Do you see now, Greg? This isn't just my house. This isn't just my finances. This is my life. And for anyone who thought they could take it from me, tonight is a lesson. Betrayal has consequences. Public consequences. Witnessed consequences. And yes, unforgettable consequences. Greg's hands trembled. Denise clutched his arm, but it was no comfort. The humiliation was not just legal or financial. It was social, public, undeniable. The eyes of everyone who mattered were on them, judging, witnessing, and silently applauding my composure. I returned to my seat, taking a slow sip of wine, letting the tension settle around me. Every whisper, every look, every gasp was a mark of victory. And yet, I knew this was only the beginning. The next stages of revenge, the subtle, long-term humiliation and exposure were still ahead. Tonight, however, I had delivered the first, most undeniable blow. Greg sat frozen, mouth open, eyes wide. Denise's face was pale, hands shaking, and the guests, 80 witnesses to decades of deception and betrayal, now understood the full extent of the story. I had not only defended myself, I had claimed victory, public and total. As the evening continued, I allowed the guests to mingle, whisper, and absorb the drama while I remained poised and calm. Each smile, each nod of approval, was a reminder that the power I had quietly cultivated over the years had finally been revealed. And for Greg and Denise, every step from here on out would be a reminder of the mistake they made, underestimating me. The next morning, the house felt different. The echoes of last night's confrontation still lingered in every room. The clinking of glasses, the murmurs of shocked guests, and most importantly, the tension radiating from Greg and Denise. They moved around cautiously, avoiding eye contact with anyone, their arrogance gone, replaced by an uneasy, almost panicked energy. I walked through the kitchen, letting them see me in my element. "Good morning," I said, my voice calm and cheerful. "I trust you both had a restful night reflecting on everything?" Greg's jaw tightened. "We need to talk," he muttered, trying to regain some semblance of control. I smiled faintly, picking up my morning coffee. "Oh, we'll talk, Greg, but I think it's important that everyone understands that some conversations need timing, and last night the timing was mine." Denise tried to interrupt, her voice small and pleading. "Please, can't we just—" I shook my head slowly. "No, not until you fully understand that you've underestimated me, that your arrogance, your betrayal, and your presumption that you could humiliate me publicly, all of that has consequences." Greg's hands clenched into fists. He had clearly stayed awake all night, running through every scenario he could, hoping for a loophole or a way to save face. But the truth was, there was none. Every move he made last night had been anticipated. Every email, every whisper, every plan meticulously prepared for. I let the silence stretch. Letting them feel the weight of it, the psychological pressure, was part of the plan. While they were panicking internally, I was calm, poised, and completely in control. Then I introduced the next layer of my strategy, the social exposure. I had carefully planned for select friends and family to start asking questions discreetly, spreading subtle truths about Greg and Denise's intentions without ever seeming like an attack, and it was already working. Over breakfast, I overheard whispered comments. "Did you see how he tried to recover?" or "I can't believe she handled it so perfectly." Each remark strengthened the humiliation, making the atmosphere unbearable for the two of them. Greg finally spoke again, desperation creeping into his voice. "This isn't how I imagined this would go. You can't just do all this and expect to walk away untouched." I tilted my head, sipping my coffee. "Why not? You tried to humiliate me in front of 80 witnesses. You thought you were clever. But here's the difference, Greg. I anticipated every move. I prepared for every possible outcome. And unlike you, I didn't act on impulse. I acted strategically." Denise looked like she might cry. We didn't mean. I held up a hand, silencing her. "Intentions mean nothing when the impact is this real. You tried to take from me, manipulate me, humiliate me, and now you are powerless. Every document, every witness, every piece of evidence, I control it, and until I choose otherwise, you have no recourse." I let my words sink in, pacing slowly around the kitchen, deliberately maintaining eye contact with both of them. Greg's face flushed red, a mixture of anger and fear. Denise's hands shook as she gripped the counter. The psychological weight of their failure was evident. Every word I spoke, every movement I made reinforced their humiliation. Then I revealed the next layer, the financial and social trap. I had quietly transferred additional assets, adjusted legal documents, and informed key business associates of the reality of ownership. It wasn't just a house or a divorce. It was a complete reversal of power that left them scrambling. "You thought you could claim my home, my assets, my life," I said softly, almost kindly, "but you forgot one thing. I never stopped planning. You may have believed yourself in control last night, but every step you take now only tightens the consequences. Every ally you hoped for has already been briefed. Every door you thought was open is locked." Greg tried to argue again, but the words caught in his throat. His desperation was palpable. Denise whispered something again, but I ignored it, letting the tension build further. By mid-afternoon, the two of them were completely on edge. Guests who had returned for informal meetings and coffee now subtly observed them, noting the shift in power. Every glance, every quiet whisper reinforced the humiliation. And I remained composed, almost serene, letting the psychological pressure mount. Finally, I delivered the verbal blow that would echo in their minds long after this day ended. "Greg, Denise, remember this. Arrogance and betrayal are not invisible. People notice. Actions have consequences. And tonight, tomorrow, and every day forward, you will live with the knowledge that you were outsmarted, publicly exposed, and rendered powerless by someone you underestimated." Their faces were pale, their voices barely audible. And as I walked away to check on other details of the day, I could feel the satisfaction settle in. Part of the revenge was legal, part public, part psychological, and the combination was devastatingly effective. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine. This was about ensuring that betrayal had a cost, one that Greg and Denise would never forget. And I knew that the final act, the ultimate revenge payoff, was still ahead. Tonight, I thought, as I sipped my tea and surveyed the house, would be the night that sealed everything. Every subtle move, every whispered truth, every carefully prepared exposure had been leading to this. And when it concluded, there would be no question. The power was entirely mine. The day had been long, but the tension in the house hadn't dissipated. Greg and Denise had spent hours moving through rooms cautiously, each step heavy with unease. Their earlier attempts to regain dignity or control had failed spectacularly. Every glance, every whisper from friends and family reminded them of the night's earlier humiliation. And I remained calm, poised, and entirely in control. By evening, I decided it was time for the final act. Every detail had been orchestrated, every consequence calculated. I gathered Greg and Denise in the grand living room, where the majority of our anniversary guests had returned for the evening's informal gathering. Their faces betrayed exhaustion, panic, and the dawning realization that this night was far from over. "Good evening," I said calmly, letting my presence dominate the room. The murmurs of the guests quieted as they watched the unfolding scene. "Tonight is the culmination of choices, actions, and consequences. And Greg, Denise, tonight is the night that the truth, long hidden, is finally revealed completely." Greg tried to speak, but I held up a hand. Silence fell. "No interruptions," I said firmly. "I want everyone here to witness this. Because what happens now is not just about property or money. It's about accountability, integrity, and the consequences of betrayal." I motioned for my lawyer, who brought forward another folder. Inside were detailed records, bank statements, signed legal agreements, and correspondence documenting Greg's and Denise's plans over the past month. I began to reveal each one slowly, carefully, allowing the room to react in real time. The gasps were immediate. Friends and family leaned forward, whispering in shock. "I had no idea," murmured one guest. "I can't believe they tried this." Greg's face drained of color. Denise's hands trembled as she clutched her bag tightly. Every attempt at a feigned expression of innocence had evaporated. The reality was laid bare in front of 80 witnesses. They had been caught in the act, and their deceit was undeniable. Then I delivered the ultimate public humiliation, a short slideshow, compiled secretly over weeks, showing private messages, hidden correspondence, and evidence of their secret plans. Each image, each snippet of text was accompanied by a quiet narration from me, explaining the deception and betrayal. The guests watched, stunned. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Some whispered quietly among themselves. And Greg and Denise? They sat frozen, powerless, realizing for the first time in decades that they were completely exposed, not just legally, but socially, publicly, and psychologically. I approached Greg slowly. "Do you see now, Greg, the arrogance, the schemes, the manipulation? It all ends here, publicly, legally, and irrevocably." Denise tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. The humiliation had stripped away every defense, every rehearsed excuse, leaving them raw and exposed. Finally, I concluded the evening with a calm declaration. "This house, these assets, this life, everything is mine. Your attempt to take it, to humiliate me, has failed completely, and the witnesses here tonight, who know the truth, will remember your choices for years to come." There was a pause, heavy and electric. Greg's face contorted with anger and defeat. Denise's eyes were wide, filled with shame and disbelief. And the guests, some clapped softly, some nodded in recognition, but all understood the complete reversal of power. I sat back, smiling faintly, calm, poised, triumphant. Every careful plan, every preparation, every quiet observation over the months had led to this moment. For Greg and Denise, there was no recovery, no escape. Every layer of their deception had been revealed, every consequence enforced, and every humiliation delivered. Public, private, legal, and social. I took a deep breath, letting the finality sink in. "Let this be a lesson," I said softly, addressing the room, but also Greg and Denise directly. "Betrayal always carries a cost, and those who underestimate me will always learn that the hard way." The room fell silent, then erupted into quiet whispers of admiration and approval. I had reclaimed my life, my home, my dignity, and my power. And for Greg and Denise, the evening would be unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. As the guests slowly began to leave, some offering quiet congratulations, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. The 32nd anniversary, which Greg had planned as a stage for his triumph, had instead become the defining moment of my victory. I walked through the house, now calm, now fully in control. The weight of years of betrayal, humiliation, and manipulation had lifted. And as I stood by the window, looking out over the grounds I had legally and strategically secured, I smiled, not with arrogance, but with satisfaction. Every move had been calculated, every consequence delivered, and the final chapter of this betrayal was now closed. I had won, completely,